All right, welcome to this deep dive, tailored just for you, the learner.
Yes.
Today we're venturing into the world of St. Augustine of Hippo,
Okay.
a towering figure from history
Absolutely.
who lived, way back,
Well,
354 to 430 AD.
that's right. You shared some excerpts from A Mente di Santo Agostinho with us.
Right.
And I think our mission today is to kind of unpack maybe the most crucial insights into his life, his intellectual journey, and the enduring power of his ideas. I mean, wow, Augustine's ideas. They're still with us today.
Yeah, and quite an evolution, quite a journey it was,
Yeah.
We've got a fascinating collection of material to work with here,
Yeah.
taking us from, well, Augustine's early, shall we say, adventurous youth
Right.
and his philosophical explorations before he became Christian, right through this very dramatic conversion,
Right.
and then his later hugely influential contributions to theology and philosophy.
Oh, yes.
So get ready to explore the mind of Augustine, a man who wrestled with desires, the search for truth, and even the very nature of time, something we still grapple with today.
Okay, let's set the stage. Augustine's life unfolded during a time, when the old philosophical certainties were really starting to fray. So it wasn't a landscape, say, dominated by one single school of thought.
Right.
Instead, you had this variety of approaches to life and to the world.
Yeah, like a marketplace of ideas.
Exactly, like a marketplace of ideas.
Yeah.
It's almost like they were competing with each other.
Yeah, and the source material really gives us a glimpse into this really vibrant intellectual scene. We had the Stoics following Zeno of Citium, who really emphasized this kind of inner strength, like virtue, self-control, and even like an acceptance, a kind of acceptance of whatever life throws your way.
Right.
Their focus was on finding peace within, regardless of external circumstances.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting to think about how that idea, that Stoic idea of inner resilience, might have contrasted with Augustine's later emphasis on divine grace.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Because you've also got the Epicureans,
Right.
who were inspired by Epicurus. And now, the original idea wasn't just about wild parties, as the Roman interpretation sometimes suggested.
Right.
Epicurus actually advocated a life of simple pleasures, the absence of pain and disturbance. It was about tranquility, not necessarily indulgence, right?
Yeah.
So both Stoicism and Epicureanism
Right.
offered ways to navigate, a chaotic world,
Yeah.
but with different ideas about where to find stability.
Exactly. Yeah, totally. And alongside them were the cynics and the skeptics,
Right.
each adding their own kind of unique flavor. The cynics questioning societal norms and conventions,
Absolutely.
while the skeptics were all about doubting the possibility of truly knowing anything for sure. It really paints this picture of a world, where people were really searching for meaning and truth in very different ways.
Totally. And what's, I think, particularly relevant for Augustine,
Yeah,
is the rise of Neoplatonism,
right.
which our source material highlights as a major influence.
Mhm.
Now, this was Plotinus's development of Plato's ideas,
Right.
but with kind of a more mystical bent.
Mm-hmm.
So the core idea here is that reality emanates from a single ultimate source,
Right.
often called the One,
Ooh.
almost like, light radiating from a sun.
Right.
Everything else is like a dimmer reflection of this ultimate reality.
Okay.
So this concept of a single ultimate source would really resonate with Augustine's later understanding of God.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe most significantly, all of this was happening alongside the growth of Christianity, which
Right.
was increasingly becoming this powerful intellectual force.
Absolutely.
It offered this completely different way of understanding, the world and our place in it. So this is the intellectual melting pot, that really shaped Augustine's early thinking.
Which brings us to Augustine himself and his early life.
Right.
So vividly recounted in his Confessions, right?
Yeah.
The source paints this really fascinating picture of his upbringing in Tagaste, North Africa.
His father, Patricius,
Right.
wasn't particularly religious,
Okay.
but his mother, Monica, was, deeply, devoutly Christian with huge hopes for her son's future.
And what really stands out from the Confessions, I think, is this Augustine's complex relationship with Monica.
Yes.
He seems to have felt, maybe a little suffocated by her very intense religious devotion, He even looks back at childhood incidents, things like, complaining about milk or disliking school, through this lens of guilt that she instilled, And it makes you wonder how much of his early internal conflict stemmed from this dynamic.
It's a compelling question. And then you have The famous pear tree theft, right?
Right, right.
On the surface, it's just kids stealing pears.
But Augustine elevates it to this act of profound wrongdoing, spending pages analyzing his motivations.
Right.
And, the source suggests that maybe the real struggle in his early life wasn't so much the external act itself, but this internal pressure.
Right.
Possibly linked to his mother's very strong moral compass.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And then there's that famous line of his, "Lord, give me chastity and continence, only not yet."
Oh, yes. Classic Augustine.
Really captures his internal battle, right?
Yeah.
With his desires.
Right.
He wanted to be pure, but he wasn't quite ready to give up his worldly pleasures.
Yeah.
And the source points out that what he really desired was the satisfaction of his lust.
Yes.
Not its eradication.
That's right.
A pretty honest admission.
Augustine throughout his life was honest.
Yeah.
Brutally honest.
Yeah, he was. And Monica was a constant presence,
Right.
even influencing his father's eventual conversion
Sure.
to Christianity. Her determination to keep Augustine on what she believed was the right path. Yes.
Is really, really quite striking. She even temporarily kicked him out of the house.
Yeah, she did.
When she disapproved of his behavior.
Yes.
It really highlights her unwavering commitment to his spiritual well-being, at least as she saw it, even if it meant taking some drastic measures.
Absolutely. And, so he's this bright young man, heads off to Carthage for his education.
Right.
And that's where he really dives into the worldly pleasures, the theater, brothels.
As the source delicately puts it.
Yes, as the source delicately puts it.
It sounds like he was finally free from his mother's direct influence, exploring a different side of life.
Absolutely. He also entered into a long-term relationship with a woman.
Right.
Now, her name isn't actually mentioned in the Confessions, and they even had a son together.
Okay.
And it's interesting that Augustine doesn't demonize her in the Confessions.
Huh.
It seems like his struggle was more about reconciling this relationship with his evolving kind of moral and spiritual understanding. And it seems like this period was really driven by this fundamental question. How could he be so drawn to what he perceived as this base and immoral,
Yeah.
yet at the same time yearn for something pure and virtuous?
Yeah.
This internal tension was really the engine driving his, intellectual and spiritual searching.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Initially, he turned to philosophy.
Okay.
And the source really emphasizes the crucial role of Cicero for Augustine.
Okay.
It was Cicero, a follower of Plato's Academy, who taught Augustine how to think critically,
Right.
how to engage in reasoned inquiry. However, Cicero showed him how to think, but he didn't provide the specific answers that Augustine was seeking about the nature of good and evil.
He didn't provide the answers, but he provided the method.
Exactly. He provided the tools. And those answers, or what Augustine believed were the answers at that time,
Right.
he found in Manichaeism.
Okay.
Now, this was a religious movement that, as the source explains, had some superficial similarities with Christianity.
Right, right.
So the core belief was a dualistic worldview, this constant struggle between the forces of good and evil, light and darkness.
Right.
And this idea of these two opposing forces really seemed to resonate with Augustine's internal conflicts.
Yeah.
He gave him this external explanation for the darkness he felt within.
Right. Yeah, like a framework.
Yes, exactly, like a framework.
Yeah.
His soul, the light within him, felt trapped by the darkness of his desires. It seemed logical,
It did.
even though the mainstream Christian church had already condemned it as a heresy.
Right.
So he's going against the grain.
He is, yeah. And unsurprisingly, Monica was not exactly thrilled
Not at all.
about her son embracing Manichaeism.
No.
Her disapproval added another layer of complexity to their already intense relationship.
Absolutely.
But despite her objections, Augustine remained committed to Manichaeism for a while,
Yep.
all the while, building his career as a teacher of rhetoric,
Right.
first in Tagaste and then later back in Carthage.
Right. But Augustine's, sharp intellect and his inherent curiosity eventually led him to question Manichaeism.
Okay.
The source points out that he started noticing these inconsistencies,
Okay.
particularly with the latest astronomical knowledge, which just didn't align with the rather mythological, explanations offered by the Manichaeans.
Right.
It seems like his rational mind just started clashing
Right.
with their cosmology.
I wasn't adding up.
Yeah, it wasn't adding up for Augustine.
Right.
And then came this really pivotal meeting with Faustus,
Okay.
who was considered a leading intellectual within the Manichaean movement.
Right.
So Augustine had all these pressing questions, especially about these scientific discrepancies, but Faustus just couldn't provide satisfactory answers.
Right.
This seems to have been a real turning point for Augustine.
Okay.
It planted these seeds of doubt in his mind about the intellectual credibility of Manichaeism.
Right. Because if your leading intellectual can't answer the question.
You're right, exactly. If he's dodging the question,
Yeah.
there's something wrong here.
Yeah. Yeah. And his mother's, strong opposition to his planned move to Rome
Oh, yes.
also kind of underscores this period, this growing intellectual and spiritual unease. I mean, the source describes this dramatic scene at the docks with Monica desperately trying to dissuade him from leaving.
Yeah.
It really highlights this tension between, Augustine's desire for, intellectual advancement and his mother's, deep spiritual concerns. And his eventual, secret departure must have been devastating for her.
Absolutely. And so he arrives in Rome.
Right.
And even though his doubts about Manichaeism are increasing,
Yeah.
he still maintains connections with the Manichaeans. Right?
Okay.
He was still drawn to the idea that sin originated from this, external dark force.
Right.
Rather than from, within his own will. So he continues his teaching career and his intellectual abilities are recognized.
Right.
Eventually, he's given this prestigious appointment as professor of rhetoric in Milan.
Wow.
And Milan was significant at the time.
Okay.
It had recently become the administrative center of the Western Roman Empire.
Right.
The empire itself was in a state of flux.
Okay.
And the source even mentioned this kind of unusual political climate with young emperors and other things like that.
Right.
But in Milan, the most influential figure, at least for Augustine, was Bishop Ambrose.
And Ambrose was really a key catalyst
Absolutely.
in Augustine's journey. The source describes him as one of the most brilliant minds in the Christian world at the time.
Oh, yes.
His sermons drew massive crowds.
Yeah, they did.
Augustine initially went to hear him just out of intellectual curiosity, about Ambrose's rhetorical skills, how he used language. But he was struck by two things. First, that a highly intelligent person, like Ambrose, could embrace Christianity. And second, that the Bible itself was far more sophisticated, far more nuanced, than he had previously understood.
Yes.
It often required allegorical interpretation rather than a purely literal one.
Exactly. And this approach to Scripture, interpreting it symbolically rather than literally, was really a revelation for Augustine.
Yeah.
It opened up this possibility of reconciling faith and reason in a way that Manichaeism just never could.
Yeah.
This intellectual credibility of Ambrose and his interpretations really challenged Augustine's previous understanding.
Yeah. And it's around this time that Monica finally joins him in Milan.
Yes.
By this point, Augustine could at least reassure her that he'd abandoned Manichaeism, which must have been a huge relief for her. However, he still hadn't embraced Christianity.
No, not fully.
He was still drawn to worldly ambitions, the pursuit of fame, financial security, and marriage.
And the source indicates that Monica, surprisingly, was supportive of his marriage plans and even helped him find a suitable young woman. An engagement followed.
Okay.
But because she was so young, they had to wait 2 years before they could marry.
Right.
And this waiting period, however, had some pretty significant personal consequences for Augustine.
Yes, the source really highlights the painful separation from his long-term partner.
Right?
The unnamed woman who was the mother of his son. She was sent back to Africa.
Yes.
And Augustine, despite being engaged, soon took another lover.
That's right.
He just found the 2-year wait unbearable.
Yeah.
It really underscores his ongoing struggle with his desires.
Exactly. And this personal turmoil really coincided with Augustine's, growing intellectual dissatisfaction with Manichaeism and his increasing struggle with what philosophers call the problem of evil.
Right.
He found it very difficult to reconcile this idea of an all-powerful good force constantly battling an equally powerful evil force.
Yeah.
This dualistic worldview just wasn't holding up under his scrutiny anymore.
Right.
And then he encounters Neoplatonism.
Okay.
Particularly the writings of Plotinus.
Right.
The source explains how Plotinus envisioned this ultimate reality as this thing called the One, with everything else emanating from it in a descending order.
Right.
Crucially, evil wasn't seen as this separate, positive force,
Okay.
but rather as the absence of good, almost like darkness being the absence of light,
Right.
a lack,
Yeah.
a privation.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's not a thing itself,
Yeah.
the absence of a thing.
Right, right,
And this was a profound intellectual breakthrough for Augustine.
right.
Neoplatonism offered this compelling alternative
Yeah.
to Manichaean dualism.
Right.
It provided a way to understand evil without positing another, ultimate power in opposition to good.
Right.
And this resonated very deeply with
Yeah.
his intellectual search for a coherent understanding of the universe.
Yeah, yeah. And during this period, he also started to seriously read the epistles of St. Paul. So he was inching closer and closer to this, Christian worldview.
Right.
But still, he hadn't fully committed.
No, not yet. Not yet.
Right.
And the pivotal moment finally arrived
Okay.
in August of 386 AD. The source vividly describes Augustine's intense internal struggle, his frustration with his own indecisiveness, leading him to seek solitude in his garden.
So he's in this state of, deep emotional distress, physically agitated.
Yes.
When he hears, a child's voice singing, "Talala," which means take up and read.
Yeah.
He initially dismisses it, thinks it's just some children's game.
Right.
But then he's suddenly overcome as if it's, a divine command.
It was a divine command.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's how he took it.
Right, right.
And so he rushes to his copy of Paul's letters,
Okay.
opens it at random,
Okay.
and the first passage his eyes fall upon is from Romans.
Right.
It was Romans 13.14,
Yeah.
urging him to cast off the works of darkness and to put on the armor of light.
Wow.
Not in carousing and drunkenness,
Yeah.
not in sexual immorality and debauchery,
Right.
not in dissension and jealousy.
Yeah.
This was the catalyst, his moment of conversion.
Right. Yeah. And he shares this experience, this transformative experience with his mother, Monica, who is understandably ecstatic.
Of course.
The source kind of wryly comments that perhaps divine intervention tailor its message to what Augustine happened to be reading at the time.
Perhaps, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, had he picked up, say, a collection of Greek tragedies, who knows what might have happened.
I know. Right.
Right.
Yeah. So Augustine's conversion really was a complete turning point. He resigned from his professorship, he abandoned his marriage plans, and was baptized by Ambrose in Milan, along with his son Adeodatus, during the Easter Vigil of 387.
Oh, what a change.
It is, yeah, huge change. And sadly, their plans to return to North Africa were cut short. Monica fell ill and died in Ostia. The source notes her later canonization as the patron saint of married women, and the somewhat amusing fact that her name is also associated with a rather different kind of tranquility, in that suburb of Los Angeles.
Yes, that's right. Peaceful Monica versus the Monica we're talking about.
Right, very different, yeah. But Monica's death essentially concludes the autobiographical portion of the Confessions, which Augustine would later write. And he eventually returns to North Africa with a group of like-minded friends and establishes this monastic community in Tagaste.
Yes, and, despite his earlier, what the source calls outbursts of passion,
Right.
Augustine was fundamentally a contemplative man.
Right.
And this monastic life of study and writing really suited him. It was during this period that he began to really develop the philosophical ideas that would have such a lasting impact.
And his deep engagement with Neoplatonism continued.
Oh, yeah.
Particularly its more mystical aspects and the idea of, the inner spirit's connection to ultimate reality.
Yeah.
He really sought to synthesize the insights of Plotinus with the teachings of Paul, essentially kind of merging Greek philosophical thought with Christian theology.
Bringing it all together.
Yeah, yeah. And this synthesis, I think, as the source really emphasizes, this was Augustine's most significant contribution.
Oh, absolutely.
It not only provided, Christianity with this very powerful intellectual framework, but it also linked it to this rich tradition of Greek philosophy, which really allowed philosophical inquiry to continue, albeit, through a Christian lens throughout the subsequent centuries.
That's right. And Augustine developed several, really original philosophical concepts during this time.
Right.
He introduced this idea of creation ex nihilo, that God created the universe from absolutely nothing, which contrasted with, the Neoplatonic idea of this timeless and undirected one. Augustine brought in this crucial element of God's will, God's intention in the act of creation.
Yeah.
It wasn't just an emanation.
Yeah.
It was a deliberate act.
Right. Yeah. And this is where his groundbreaking theory of time comes in.
Ah, yes.
He argued that God exists outside of time altogether, and that time itself began with the creation of the universe.
That's right.
So the question of, what was God doing before creation is actually, nonsensical,
Right.
because before time didn't exist. It's like asking, what's north of the North Pole?
Exactly. It's a category mistake.
It is, yeah.
We're trying to impose our categories of understanding on something that transcends those categories.
Right.
And what's particularly insightful, I think, is his understanding that time, as we experience it,
Yes.
is subjective. It exists in the human mind. It's a way we perceive and measure the flow of events. And, the source even points out that this kind of anticipates the work of the philosopher Kant by over 1,000 years.
It does. That's amazing.
It is amazing.
Yeah. And he also had these, early insights into self-awareness and existence.
Right.
Long before Descartes' famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am.
Right.
The source highlights that Augustine essentially articulated that idea centuries earlier in his work, Soliloquies. And it makes you wonder what directions Western thought might have taken if his, successors have really fully explored this line of inquiry.
Oh, that's an interesting thought experiment, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
So in 391 AD,
Okay.
Augustine is ordained as a priest in Hippo, somewhat against his will,
Okay.
as he actually preferred his monastic life.
Okay.
But just 5 years later, he becomes the auxiliary bishop.
Okay.
And then, following the death of the previous bishop, he becomes the full bishop of Hippo.
Wow.
And, being a bishop in those days
Right.
was far more than just spiritual guidance. The source notes that he was also the local authority on theology,
Right.
a teacher,
Yeah.
and even a kind of judge.
Yeah.
So quite a lot of responsibility.
He had a lot on his plate.
Yeah.
And despite all of those responsibilities, Augustine continued his prolific writing, including, his very influential Confessions.
Okay.
However, the source points out that not all of his extensive writings were, of the same enduring quality.
Okay.
Like many converts, he became, quite concerned with the precise details of church doctrine, dedicating, a considerable amount of his energy to denouncing what he considered deviations from orthodox belief. The Manichaean heresy, which he himself had once embraced, became a particular target of his criticism.
Right. Yeah, and he also engaged in these other major theological disputes. There were the Donatists, this Christian sect in North Africa, who advocated for a very strict separation of the church from the state.
And they even had some pretty radical social ideas.
The Donatists were very uncompromising in their views. They believed that the validity of the sacraments depended on the moral purity of the priest administering them. And their opposition to the mainstream church and to the Roman state was almost welcomed by some of them.
Okay.
As a sign of the world's corruption. Their emphasis on penance and martyrdom made them a very challenging group to engage with.
Yeah.
Because, opposition often just reinforced their beliefs.
Yeah.
So Augustine spent a significant amount of time and effort writing against the Donatist views.
Right, yeah. And then there was, the Pelagian controversy. Sparked by the monk, Pelagius.
Right.
He really challenged Augustine's core doctrines of grace and predestination. He argued that humans, have the free will to achieve salvation through their own efforts without the necessity of divine grace. And this just directly contradicted, Augustine's understanding of original sin,
Right.
and our dependence on God.
This really provoked a strong reaction from Augustine.
Yeah.
He vehemently defended his doctrine of grace,
Right.
arguing that ultimately salvation is a gift from God,
Right.
not something that's earned by human merit.
Right.
And he wrote extensively against Pelagius and his followers.
Yeah.
And, the source notes that Augustine became widely known throughout the Christian world as this staunch defender of, Orthodox theology.
Yeah. And it's quite remarkable, as the source points out, that a thinker, of Augustine's intellectual caliber would devote so much time and energy to these very specific theological debates, especially against this backdrop of, the crumbling Roman Empire. It seems like, the intellectual focus of the time was so intensely directed towards these, internal discussions within the Christian faith.
And then in 410 AD,
Okay.
Rome was sacked by Alaric and the Visigoths.
Right.
Now, this was a truly shocking event for the Roman world. It was the first time in centuries that foreign invaders had breached the city walls.
Wow.
This was a catastrophe.
Yeah.
And it led many to blame the abandonment of the traditional pagan gods in favor of Christianity for Rome's downfall.
Right.
They saw it as a punishment.
Yeah.
And Augustine's response to this was his massive work, The City of God.
Yes, The City of God.
The source notes that, it could be a challenging read for modern audiences.
Right.
But it offered a comprehensive Christian interpretation of history, framing the fall of Rome within a larger divine plan.
Right.
And he presented this contrast between the earthly city, focused on worldly pursuits and temporal power, and the city of God, this spiritual community based on.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.